Olá, tudo bem? Eu sou a Márcia Schuller, do site Grão Especial, e hoje eu vou mostrar para vocês uma entrevista que eu fiz com a Amelia Evans. A Amelia Evans é diretora-executiva do MSI Integrity. A Amelia é advogada, formada em Harvard, e ela conduziu um vasto estudo sobre as certificações como Rainforest Alliance, UTZ e Fairtrade, e chegou a uma triste conclusão. As certificações não são mais ferramentas para conter o avanço das grandes corporações na proteção dos direitos humanos. A matéria completa está lá no nosso site, no www.grãoespecial.com.br, inclusive com a resposta, com o posicionamento oficial da Rainforest Alliance sobre o estudo desenvolvido pela Amelia, que durou quase 10 anos e entrevistou inúmeras grandes corporações e diversas cadeias produtivas. Muito obrigada, espero que vocês gostem e entrem lá no nosso site para ler a matéria completa. Até a próxima. Até logo.
Dozens of these initiatives that have just popped up over the last few, since really the early 90s, as I'm sure you know about. In the coffee and commodities and agriculture sector, there's so many. There's Rainforest Alliance, there's Fairtrade. There's also in Brazil of kind of relevance of those that are addressing deforestation. There's just this huge number of them. And I think for me, the most important thing to remember at the outset of this is that all of these initiatives have emerged because global North and global South, but global North governments in particular, have failed in their fundamental duty of ensuring that large corporations respect human rights when operating both at home but abroad. And so these voluntary initiatives have sort of operated to try to fill the gap. And so for us, this question has been like, this is a huge experiment in business and human rights. And has this experiment worked? And what we have found is fundamentally, it has not worked at protecting human rights. And the reason for that is just the way that these initiatives are designed. They're too, frankly, they've become captured by corporations and corporate interests, and they're not reflecting the needs of rights holders on the grounds. And I'm happy to give you a couple of some of the key areas where we see that. So one major area where this comes up for us is precisely what you talked about, which is that the actual standards and the way that what is being assessed is very problematic. And it leads to two particular problems. One, there's a misperception about what these different initiatives are actually addressing. Over 3/4 of the initiatives use words like responsible, fair, equitable, sustainable. But what do those words mean? They do not mean that workers are actually being paid a living wage. In all the initiatives we looked at, only one actually requires that workers are being paid a fair wage. So there's this, first of all, there's this gap of understanding what's really being assessed. So, there's just there's a set perception from a consumer's perspective where it's oh, this is great. I'm buying coffee that's, fair trade or it's sustainable. That means all of these workers are being treated fairly. Fundamentally, there's this big gap that's going on. Mm-hmm. Secondly, the question is who's being asked to fulfill these standards and to change? And what we've seen is that the burden is being put primarily on producers and the global South. So in Brazil, the obligation is much more on small scale farmers and plantations than it is on actually the big brands. And when you look at the huge profit margins of what's going on, the profit is much more at the supply chain end with brands who have so much more money to spend than it is down at the kind of production side. And there's two consequences to this. One is, as you've noted, that the smallest farmers, those who are most vulnerable, who are operating at the family or small scale level, are being completely shut out of the system. Why? Because it's incredibly expensive to get certification. Yes. And of the 8 most prominent initiatives that we looked at, there was not any effort to actually substantially offset the cost for small farm holders or for family farm holders. Mm. So instead, what that's doing is putting more pressure on these big corporations to source from large scale plantations, from larger kind of growers. And what does that mean? The most vulnerable are locked out and becoming even more poor and even more vulnerable because they're not able to participate in global change. Secondly, It also means that these large producers are now being put under pressure themselves to pay for the costs of certification and to demonstrate change without necessarily actually getting any more money. And what does that mean? It means that you've just got all of this pressure again on the growers and producers without really changing the purchasing practices of large brands. There are not within these initiatives strict requirements that say you need to pay particular fair prices that we guarantee go to workers. There are not requirements around here's responsible lead times or fair negotiating practices. And so there's just, again, more and more burdens being placed in the global south, while the global north, the brands, get a lot of the benefits. So this is one of the major structural problems we've seen. And to be clear, this is across all of these initiatives. Like, what we're saying is it's not just one initiative that's a problem. This is a system-wide issue. The other issue that comes up that's particularly problematic is just the way in which this monitoring occurs. And it's precisely, as you said, Marcia, which is that the monitoring is all top-down. It's coming in by third-party auditors. And in our experience of talking to different workers and communities in places from Cameroon to the Philippines, we consistently hear that they've often been, they're afraid to speak up. They're not sure what's going to happen if they report violations. There's often an introduction to the auditor or the monitor by management themselves. So there's a sense that there's a collusion going on. Mm-hmm. And then there's often just fundamental failures. For example, like looking at Fairtrade, Fairtrade does not require that there's a female auditor that comes in. And that means women who may be experiencing sexual harassment in the workplace may feel very uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Number of initiatives don't require local languages to be spoken, there to be any training on awareness of the local context. And if you just put yourself in the position of somebody who's working, on a plantation or working at a farm or in a factory, and there's just somebody who comes in who's been chatting with management, who suddenly comes up to you and says, how are the conditions at work? May not have offered you any protection if you're going to speak up, and you have no idea what's going to happen if you report abuse. And this job is incredibly important to you because you're vulnerable. Now, what we've just heard and seen is that the odds of people speaking up honestly and truthfully are just not there, because why would you? You'd risk losing your job, you risk losing so much, and for what? And so this kind of monitoring system is incredibly ineffective. And that's why we believe time and time again, we're seeing violations on certified farms and factories. In 2018, there was a study that found that tea plantations in Sri Lanka had forced labor on them. There was another that found there was less than 14 cents per hour was being paid to workers. And these were all at plantations being certified by the Rainforest Alliance, UTZ, and Fairtrade. And in the cocoa sector, the Washington Post has put out a huge expose showing the amount of child labor there. And so really what we're seeing is this entire system is fundamentally flawed. Now, I could keep going and going into all of the different reasons why these things are not working, and I'm happy to. But I also think it's probably useful for us to think about, well, what are the alternatives at some point too? Yes. Would you like me to keep talking through the kind of fundamental?
Please. Yes, please, yes.
Yeah, so another problem that we've seen that's systemic across these is that, so there's two types of way you could imagine that violation can be reported. One is if these kind of third-party monitors are coming in to look to see what the conditions are on a particular place. The other is just if a rights holder, a worker, a farmer, or a factory worker can just report, can actually contact the initiative and say, I'm experiencing abuse here. Now, of the 40 initiatives that we looked at, a third of them didn't have any mechanism whatsoever for workers or communities to be able to report violations. What that means is that a company could be committing abuses and there's no way for this to be able to be reported. The company could continue to get certified or otherwise remain a member, and the abuse goes on, and it will only be detected if a monitor happens to catch that problem. And as we've already established, these monitoring systems do not work. The other problem is that of the 2/3 that do have sort of complaints mechanisms or the ability for people to blow the whistle, those mechanisms do not meet even the most fundamentally basic requirements of what makes for an effective grievance mechanism as set out by the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Basic issues like lack of transparency, lack of accessibility. Again, to come back to fair trade, if you want it as, you know, you're a worker or a farmer in a small scale space in Brazil, you want to report the conditions that are going on, or perhaps at the plant in a plantation. The only way for you to do that is to go to their website, which is completely in English, and find find somewhere buried deep this complaints process. And then there's no support or any kind of interpretation or translation that's offered to you. There's no ability for you to complain anonymously, which means you would have to risk the possibility that your employer would find out that you're saying, look, this plantation has got horrendous working conditions, I'm being exploited. And then the results of these complaints are not transparently published. And so it's these types of issues that we have found, again, systemic. I don't want to point out fair trade as a problem. In fact, of all of the initiatives, fair trade is one that does, frankly, a little better than the others, which is precisely the problem.
Okay. And I know they had their paper when they were created. It was important for the market, it was important for the big industry, for the consumers, but nowadays it seems that it doesn't work anymore. And I think you have a huge role because you are working amongst big industries to convince them that they have to do more. I am correct.
100%. I mean, I agree. I think at the time when these initiatives were formed, they represented a possibility for change. For a long time, corporations had not been willing to do anything. So the very fact that some were now willing to sit at the table and come up with an agreement and standards, I can completely understand how exciting and potentially transformative this was. But for us, we now feel like, look, 3 decades into this experiment, it's time to look at the results. And unfortunately, despite the best intentions of many people, we feel this experiment has failed. And so the question then becomes, well, what can we do instead? And I would point to 3 things. The first is we need to really rethink the role of these initiatives. Actually, the initiatives can have some value in terms of they're an opportunity for NGOs and civil societies to engage directly with corporations, to have conversations, to do learning, to experiment, for there to be trust building and dialogue. What we shouldn't be relying on them for anymore is actually reliably ensuring that they protect human rights or that they provide rights holders with any kind of access to remedy. Instead, we need to think about 2 alternatives. One is, for those initiatives that are going to remain, they need to actually be legally binding standards. And we have real reservations about whether any of these initiatives can transform to meaningfully do this, because there's so much corporate control within these initiatives now, period. But there are some hopeful models emerging in which workers themselves have designed and come up with reporting mechanisms where they go to the final brand that's buying the product. In this particular instance, I'm thinking of it's tomatoes, where if on their farm they see tomato violations occurring, they then go to the final buyer, whether that's Walmart or Whole Foods, and they say, we're experiencing violations. And there's a legally binding commitment there that means that as a result, there will be change that occurs, and that the brand will enforce that on the actual farm. And in addition, there's actually an agreement to pay more direct money to the farms to ensure workers are getting paid more. So that's one possibility. The other is to just demand more regulation of corporations. And this needs to happen at the international level, the national level, and locally. And we need to see that kind of happening much more aggressively. There's been a real erosion and a slip away from trying to regulate corporations, and a belief and a hope that voluntary efforts kind of could or might work. And so we just need to put all of the energy and resourcing that's been going into voluntary initiatives into mandatory initiatives. So those are sort of two options in terms of thinking about the corporate form as it stands. Rethink the MSI and then think about maybe different types of initiatives that center workers. And the initiative type I was thinking of is called the Worker-Driven Social Responsibility Network, and it's worth checking out. Are you familiar with it?
Kind of, but let me ask you something. When you talk about the experience of the tomato farmers in Florida, right?
Mm-hmm.
You are talking about a country that is developed already. And you have laws, you have people to take care of these people. And the farmers, they studied more, they know the laws, they know their rights. It's kind of different when you say that, or when you driven that to the underdeveloped countries. Brazil is an underdeveloped country, but it has its laws. You know, it's not fair if you compare, for instance, with Panama or some countries from Africa. It's much more difficult.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think that there's the question of what would work in Brazil is a question for actual workers themselves in Brazil, I think, to start to figure out and propose solutions through organizing, through kind of education, and through cross exchanges from these types of other initiatives to say, could and how could this take off here? And I will say that there's been an effort to try to develop this style of model in Bangladesh and most recently in Lesotho. And so we are seeing it expand outside of the United States. I can't personally speak to how effective those international efforts have been, and I share with you some kind of real questions about whether that could work or not. I guess the other piece for me that feels really important, though, is that part of what we need to think about is starting to challenge the corporate form itself, which is to say, we have just accepted that corporations are there to maximize profit for shareholders. Mm-hmm. And I think that all of this effort and looking at how can we voluntarily get these companies to sort of be better is a fool's errand. The first sort of point that we should be doing is saying the corporate form needs to change. That, of course, these boards and management are endlessly leading to human rights violations because they're just trying to think about shareholders and profit. Sure. Now, what if the corporate form was changed so that it was actually legally accountable to its workers and its communities? And that was the central inquiry. If what an ethical company was not necessarily one that just sourced sort of fairly, but ensured that, you know, all of its workers and its affected communities, including those in its supply chain, actually shared in its profit rather than all of that money going elsewhere. So it's that kind of change that I think is fundamentally important too.
What you are saying is so much in 21st century and they still in 19th century. How can we change that in a quick way, I mean?
I think part of it is just, I do think that the opportunity, as terrible as COVID is, there's a moment right now where people are prepared to say, everything is fundamentally broken. These systems that we're operating in are inherently unequal and are leading to massive inequities, and this is not okay. And so I actually think the moment for change is right now. And so starting to get people to think transformatively is so important. But I'm really curious, what do you think is the right solution and change?
I don't know, I just ask questions. I mean, I know if you are a CEO, of course you want to give as much money as you can for your stakeholders, but for a human being, I know it's wrong. You know, I mean, it's not wrong to give money to them by a good job you did, right? By a result of a good job. But your good job, it doesn't mean that the other people must suffer, you know?
Agreed.
And you are in the middle of the nightmare, let's say that, because America is what the world has, I mean, it's the capitalism itself, right? And you are there, and how can you convince them that, okay, it's good to have money, it's good to get money from what you are providing, but let's share a little bit more. How can you do that in US?
Well, I actually think, Yeah, I mean, I think that in the United States, because as you say, it's the seat of kind of capitalism, it's also a place where the worst consequences of this unchecked capitalism is playing out too in its own way. And so there is incredible poverty happening here with next to incredible wealth, just as there are in many parts of the world. And so the US is not exempt from seeing what happens when everybody is not treated fairly and not considered essentially dignified. And so there's a growing movement here and a growing appetite for change. And I would say that there's more experiments that I have seen in the last sort of 3 to 5 years in terms of saying the current system isn't working. How can we create an economic system that is by the people, for the people, and that centers the planet as well. And so I think the question is sort of like, how can we harness that? Because there are important experiments going on. And I would say actually in the United States, a lot of learning is happening by looking to countries where there's been more efforts to do this for a long time. For example, in Brazil, the way in which, you know, a number of kind of collectives are organized around the kind of trash pickers to see like, well, how are they sharing and dealing with sort of poverty and inequality? Those models are being now studied in the United States to say, how can we think about what it would mean to have collective governance and collective sharing and starting to play that out. And that's very different from what was happening here 10 or 15 years ago. Yeah. So I think it's more conversations like this one to spread the word and to push people to start saying the status quo is not sufficient that are really, really important.
But you think the big corporations, are they ready to talk this subject?
Sorry, say that again?
The big corporations, are they prepared to talk this subject?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's been a lot of conversations about the Business Roundtable, for example, last year issued a statement saying we need to rethink the purpose of the corporation. Mm-hmm. Then the World Economic Forum, which is kind of an organization and held in Davos each year, has said it's promoting stakeholder capitalism. So I think there is a recognition on the part of corporations that change is needed. My concern, however, is that the type of change that's going to be suggested is going to be very, very facile and very weak. And it's going to look a lot like the sorts of initiatives that we've talked about here, where you bring in other stakeholders, you give them a voice, but you don't actually give them power. And so I think one of the important lessons to learn from this big experiment of voluntary initiatives is that what really needs to happen is a transfer of power. And that we need to start saying to corporations, if you're going to start talking as you have been about, you know, being, having a different purpose, being more accountable to a wider group of stakeholders, what that actually means is handing power over to workers and communities. And until that transfer has occurred, then everything you're saying is simply words and rhetoric, and it's not transformation.
I didn't have the time, or I just forgot to introduce you and your job. Amelia, you are a co-founder of the Institute of Multi-Executive MSI Integrity, based in US, right?
Correct.
But you are from New Zealand or Australia?
New Zealand, yes.
You are from New Zealand. How long are you living in US?
For over a decade now.
A decade now, okay. So I would like you to just make a short announcement what your institute are dealing nowadays.
What, so the MSI Integrity?
Yes.
What we're doing now, we have learned that voluntary efforts by corporations to protect human rights have failed. And we believe central to that failure is the corporate form itself. That as long as corporations are set up and required to maximize profit for shareholders who are outside of the company, that we're endlessly going to be just chasing after abuse. And so what we're starting to do is to look beyond the corporation and to start to develop and propose business models, like many that have existed before us, that center workers and communities in their governance and ownership.
But you just launched a new research, right?
Mm-hmm.
How many people did you listen? And can you tell me a little bit more about your research, please?
This is the report, not fit for purpose?
Yes.
Well, that report is a reflection of a decade's worth of research. And so over the course of that decade, we conducted many different research projects and looked at many different initiatives. In total, we've analyzed well over 1,500 pages of different procedures and policies. We've spoken to hundreds of different stakeholders, including community members in Azerbaijan, Cameroon, the Philippines, to the United States. And so it's been a very comprehensive experience that we've had, and we've been in the center of many conversations and dialogues from the United Nations level through to local level kind of workshops that have been focused on and thinking about multi-stakeholder initiatives. So this report is a reflection of the key insights we've gained over that decade of doing this work. And unfortunately, the conclusion is pretty dire, which is to say these voluntary initiatives are just not working.
But you were just launching this project. You had some articles in the press, international press. But can you tell me how was how the American people realize about your job, about what the research?
You know, it's hard to...
Impression, actually. Did they know that? They were astonished? What happened?
We're still gauging that. It's so hard to get a sense. I mean, I think that a lot of people actually, based off, we had a strong article in The Guardian, and a lot of the response we've got, based at least on social media, is not that surprised, unfortunately. Okay. There's a sense from a lot of people that they understood that these systems weren't working, but they didn't have the evidence. And so I think, again, there's this understanding that we need different and better and more robust systems that center workers and communities within them. And in many ways, this work isn't shocking. It's just one more step towards getting us to where we need to
go. What we see in Brazil, especially with the farmers, is that they are very proud of their certifications. Most of them, the big majority, I don't think they know, they realize the problems that those certifications have. And they have to pay a lot for that. In Brazil, some of them are kind of $10,000. For our currency, it's quite expensive. What do you think all this discussion is going on? What's going to be the next step?
I mean, I think that the question of how expensive these are for small farmers is a real problem. You know, we looked, for example, there's a study that was done into the round table of sustainable palm oil, which presents a similar story to what you're talking about, where passing certification costs somewhere between 5 to 14% of the annual revenue of these small farm holders in Indonesia. And it's just not kind of making sense economically for them to actually participate, because the premium they get might be only 1 to 4% back in terms of additional prices. Mm-hmm. So I think over time, at least in the certification schemes, my hunch is that what's going to happen is that more and more of these smaller farmers are going to be crowded out of the initiatives, and it's only going to be a space for large scale production. And we've seen consistent problems with that. And so I think the question is, now that there's a lot more documentation as a result of this report coming out, are consumers and governments going to actually stand up and say, this system, while we were hopeful it could work, hasn't, and it's time for a deep reform and for us to actually come up with much more binding regulation that oversees the behavior of our large corporations.
So, and how to convince the consumers, let's say from Europe, that like to buy specialty coffee from Brazil or specialty cacao, that they don't have to look anymore for certifications, or I mean, not, they don't have to make a big deal about that.
I'm not sure. That's not my wheelhouse. It seems very difficult. I mean, it's very difficult as a consumer to figure out how to shop ethically. And I think part of the delusion we're under is that we can address our concerns about rights abuses and ethics through consumption. And in fact, I think that one of the key ways, in fact, we need to be addressing our concerns is the way that we vote and the way that we participate politically. And that it's a kind of laziness, frankly, as much as I do it too, as I'm sure, you know, many people do. You try to make all the decisions that you can to be an ethical person. But in fact, just operating in the consumer mindset, we've got such limited information about what's truly ethical and what's not. And so I'm just not sure it's the most appropriate way. But as I said, again, I think that there are other models that are worker-driven and developed. And I really encourage people to look into the worker-driven social responsibility models as alternatives. And I'm sure that there are others too.
Have you had the opportunity to talk to the people from the certifications, UTZ or Fairtrade, all that kind, and show them the result of their job?
Yeah, we've shared the results. We've shared the report with all of the MSIs, and they also had the opportunity to look at the underlying data sets and provide comments to us last year. And we've set up, have offered to set up meetings one-on-one with any of the staff from these initiatives in August for those who want to sort of have a deep dive. And so I'm looking forward to a number of those conversations with those people.
Where it's going to happen?
They're going to be sort of online private conversations at this stage. And then we're also doing a July 30th event, which is open to the public, where, and I believe a number of MSIs are participating as attendees in terms of talking through the key results of the study and then looking to alternative worker-driven solutions.
Do you think your work can effectively help this situation?
I hope so. I mean, I think that, you know, it's always important to be able to be armed with evidence to understand truly what's going on. And obviously it's going to take more than one report. It's going to require actually policymakers to pick this up and to take action. It's going to require consumers to start demanding different practices on behalf of corporations. It's going to require civil society and NGOs to look at this and think, well, how do we change? And, you know, I will do all that I can and speak to as many people as possible to try to get the word out there. And I just hope that others like you are rising to the occasion of trying to turn this into action.
Do you follow the cacao industry?
I do, but not closely. We looked at 40 different initiatives covering almost every global industry, aside from the only one that's not covered by any of these is the pharmaceutical industry. And so I sort of have a broad understanding of all of the issues, but I wouldn't profess to be an expert.
How can a Brazilian help you?
I'm not sure. How do you think that you can?
I don't know. Do you have a branch in South America or something like that you can talk to the farmers?
We would love that opportunity. I wonder if what would be helpful is if people who are listening to this, who are part of local communities, who are part of unions, who are part of NGOs, who are academics, I would always appreciate to sort of hear from you to see if there are ways in which we can have deeper conversations and to consider like potential sort of local partnership and getting this out there. The report at the moment is only available in English. And I think if we understood there was a demand for it to be in Portuguese, we would definitely do what we can to get it translated.
How can I get a copy of this report in your website?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Anything else you'd like to talk about this huge work you've done?
No, just to say thank you so much for this opportunity. It's been lovely to be able to spend, almost a good 45 minutes sort of talking through these things and to go in this level of depth and to thank you for being prepared to be so detailed. I think that there's so much here for people to really think about, and these are hard issues because there's no obvious solution. So it's not easy stuff to explore.
Thank you very much for your time, your patience, and I hope you have a big success, because we all need that in the 21st century. We cannot live anymore in the past. Let's get better, make our lives better and the other people's lives better too.
Agreed. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.